Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar presented by Meat and Livestock Australia and ParaBoss. My name is Liz Baiocchi, and I work for the University of New England as a ParaBoss project officer. A big thanks first to Meat and Livestock Australia, as this webinar has been developed under MLA's New England WormBoss Producer Demonstration Site project. But this topic applies equally across all regions in Australia. It's on worm testing in sheep, how it will benefit your worm control program, and how easy it is to do. I'd now like to introduce you to Deb Maxwell from the University of New England. Deb is the Executive Officer of ParaBoss, and she's been at the forefront of the development of ParaBoss in conjunction with parasitologists, researchers, and veterinarians from around the country. Welcome, Deb. We're all looking forward to what you can tell us tonight about worm testing.
Thanks very much, Liz. And as Liz said, this webinar will outline the benefits of worm tests and how to do them. So the very first thing we'll get straight into is about clearing up any confusion about names. Now, when a sample of feces of a known weight in a known dilution is put under the microscope and eggs are counted, that's a worm test being done. And this same thing is also called a worm egg count, a WEC, a fecal egg count, or a FEC. But this is different to the next step that can be done, which is to identify the types of worms, some of them to the species level, and to estimate the proportion of each worm in the sample. And we call this a larval culture, or a larval differentiation, or simply just a larval diff, and some people call it worm typing. Now, these tests shouldn't be confused with tests that determine the effectiveness of a drench. Now, these use worm egg counts and larval cultures as part of their overall process, but in a way that determines which worm types and how many of them were killed by a particular drench. And we call them drench tests, or drench resistance tests, or drench checks. So firstly, what is the benefit of a worm test? Well, they tell you how wormy your sheep are, of course, at any point in time. We know that the adult worms in the gut of sheep produce eggs that are passed out with the sheep's dung. And so by counting the number of worm eggs in a specific weight of dung, that indicates the size of the worm burden present in your sheep. And you can do this test at home, or you can send it to a laboratory. Now, if you know the size of the worm burden, that's going to tell you whether drenching is warranted. So WormBoss recommendations have drenching thresholds, and they're based on what those worms are costing you versus the cost of treating those worms. Now, you can also find out what species of worm you have, as I mentioned, with a larval culture, but identifying them requires considerable experience, and it's only done by some laboratories. If you know the worm type, this sometimes can lead to a different choice of drench or timing of a drench, so it can be quite valuable. Now, you can also use worm testing as part of a drench check or a drench test to determine the effectiveness of drenches. And of course, worm tests can also be used by ram breeders to help identify how resistant a sheep is to worms. Now, I'm assuming most of you have joined us today because you don't worm test or you don't do it regularly. And that could be for any one of a number of reasons, including I already know when to drench, I don't know what's involved, I haven't got time, it takes too long to get results, or it's too expensive. But I'm also assuming that you're here because you've heard you should do it and you want to see and hear more about the benefits and how to do it. Well, let's go through some of these common answers and challenge your old reasoning. But first of all, are you a drenchaholic? Now, although you might feel like you're doing the right thing by sheep by regularly drenching, it's not always cost effective. So aside from seeing sheep with obvious signs of worms, a worm egg count's the only way that you can be sure if you have a worm problem that needs to be treated with a drench product. The most common worm control mistake is guessing whether you need to drench or not. And it can cost you time and money. It mightn't do anything to the sheep, and in fact, it could lead to drench resistance. So, if you think you already know when to drench without a worm test, there's actually a good chance you're drenching at a time that's not cost effective. You could be drenching too soon or too late. Now, of course, the timing of worm tests and drenches varies between farms and seasons. And if you're a grazier in a very low rainfall area where maybe only 1 or 2 drenches per year are needed anyway, at times like weaning and pre-lambing, a worm test won't really be needed for those strategic times. But if you drench more often, let's say at every 6 weeks in the barber's pole season, or even sooner than this, then your current control really isn't effective. And the paddocks are probably so highly contaminated with worm larvae that the time since the last drench has become for you a valid drenching indicator. But that's not an ideal situation. If you're in the moderate to higher rainfall areas, testing regularly should be part of an integrated program. And when you use grazing management, breeding for resistance, choosing effective drenches and using those drenches wisely, then it will greatly reduce the contamination of your pastures, and in turn it will take much longer before sheep need a drench. And when that happens, a person's ability to predict when a drench is really needed goes right out the window. So to reiterate, if you know you have to drench every 4 to 6 weeks or so after a drench, then your worm control program is not really effective. In an effective program, you'll often go much longer, and unless you wait till it's too late when signs are occurring, you won't know when the cost-effective time to drench is without a worm test. Okay, so when should you drench? Well, if you can already see clinical signs of a worm infection, you're well past the time when it would have been most cost-effective to drench. Production loss due to worm infections, such as reduced weight gain and wool growth in sheep, have already started if there is scouring, weight loss, or a tail in the mob from scour worms, or anemia, bottle jaw, and sheep going down on mustering from barber's pole worms. Now, a drench now is necessary when you see signs, but it will never recoup those production losses. But if you move to an integrated program from an unplanned approach, then you'll reduce the amount of larval contamination on pasture and you won't need to drench as often. Now, this slide here is for barber's pole worms, but if you're in an area with scour worms, the same principle applies, but it'll be just at lower egg counts. Now, I'll just run you through this graph because there's a few things on here. Have a look on the left-hand side of the graph here, and we're talking about the worm egg count, and it's rising as you go up the left-hand side. And then along the bottom, we've got the level of production loss increasing to the right. And you've got this line going up here, which is that interaction between worm egg count and production loss. So as the worm egg count rises, the production loss is increasing as well. Now, the typical drenching thresholds in the New England region are between 600 and 1200 eggs per gram, depending on the condition of the sheep and the pasture. Now, those levels would be much lower for scour worms. And you can find those drench thresholds in the WormBoss programs and drench decision guides for each region. Now, here you can see that the most cost-effective time to drench the sheep is when that average is around about 600 to 1200 for the barber's pole worm. And then what happens is, as you increase, it goes up here, and gradually more and more you see clinical signs start to appear. But if you wait until this point in time, I just keep losing my mouse, sorry. If you wait until that time, you've lost all this level of production loss that you won't get back, and this would have been the time when you should have drenched for cost effectiveness. Now, with Barber's poleworm, with Barber's poleworm, you're going to see anemia, bottle jaw, and things like that up here. With scoureworms, it'll be scouring, weight loss, tail in the mob, that sort of thing. So if you use the signs as your indicator to drench, you'll suffer from this loss that you won't get back. If you used a worm egg count, you've done it at the right time where it's balancing up against the cost to drench your sheep. Now, in summary, if you aren't following an integrated worm control program, you're most likely drenching based on the time since last drench. And in high rainfall areas during the warm months, that's probably every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, as the sheep are being rapidly reinfected, the pasture contamination is high, you just sort of get into this routine of having to keep drenching. Of course, you might also be drenching when you start to see the signs, such as scouring or weight loss or anemia. Remember, if you're doing that, production loss has already started, and the cost of those losses is already much greater than had you drenched earlier based on worm egg counts. Now, I'll just say that worm tests have a lower value to you if all you do is rely on drenching. Once you start to apply the other strategies to control worms, the value of those worm tests increase considerably. Now, WormBoss has got programs for 8 regions across Australia, and each program includes practical strategies that are relevant and timed to the regional conditions and the worm species that affect your area. Now, those strategies are grazing management, breeding for worm resistance, when to drench, when to worm test, and managing drench resistance. And each of these programs can improve your profitability and the welfare of your sheep through fewer deaths, less illness from worms, fewer drenches, particularly long-acting drenches. It'll improve your productivity, and the big bonus is it'll prolong the life of your drenches. It's pretty hard to believe, I think, that a program can be both more effective and use less drenches and less of your time, but the WormBoss programs can do just that. Now, other people might not do worm tests because they don't know what's involved. Worm testing is pretty easy, really. In a minute, I'll show you a video of how to worm test. But basically, you collect a worm test kit from your local agent, or you call your local lab, and they'll give you the instructions on what they require. Now, if you need to find your local lab, have a look on the WormBoss website, go up to the tests and tools, and then choose the professional service providers. Then you can choose your state. I'm going to choose New South Wales here. And that will come up with a list of service providers in your area. And at the top, you'll see that W stands for worm egg count testing. Have a look now down the right-hand columns to see which providers do worm egg counts. And then you just have to get in touch with them, and they'll let you know everything that you need. Okay. Once you've got your worm test kit or bags or containers, go to your mob, hold them against a fence or in the corner of a paddock for a few minutes, and then you let them walk off slowly so they don't kick the piles of dung around, and you go and collect the dung from the ground. Now, make sure what you're collecting is from the fresh, warm, moist piles, from either 10 separate piles for a standard 10-count test, or from 20 to 40 piles if you're going to use a bulk sampling method. Now, put your samples in the containers or bag according to the instructions from your lab. Then complete the submission form or the information that the lab has requested. Now, get samples to the lab within a day or so, or test it yourself and wait for the results to be sent back. From here, you can look on the WormBoss website at the Drench Decision Guide for your region to use your worm egg count to decide whether to drench. Now, To find the drench decision guide relevant to you, head to the WormBoss website, click on Tests and Tools, then you'll see the drench decision guides, and then click on the sheep DDGs, or if you happen to have goats, you can go to the goat drench decision guides, and then you can select the particular region from your list. Once you're there, click on I agree, start the drench decision guide, and start answering the simple questions. Now you see here, you don't have to type anything in. All you've got to do is press one of the buttons when you get asked a question. And that will lead you to a particular recommendation based on your questions. And that's where it'll tell you what to do. Now, alternatively, if you don't want to do it online, you can go back to that same place, and here you can print a copy of your particular drench decision guide. And if you do that, this is what you're going to see. It's a two-page document. On the front, it's got the various questions. They're the same questions that are on the online version, but we've just got them onto a two-page document. And on the second page are all the various recommendations. And once you answer the questions, it will take you through and bring you to one of the relevant recommendations. Okay. Now, I said I'd show you a bit of a video. Unfortunately, WebEx's not too excited about videos, but we've got an animation just showing you some photos so that you can see what's involved. So the first thing, you go out to your paddock, your sheep are out there grazing, approach the mob, and they'll run into a group. Just put them along a fence line and hold them there for a few minutes, and while you're doing that, they'll pass some dung. After a few minutes, go and get your gear, get your gloves, get your bottles, and by the time you wander back, the sheep will hopefully have wandered off at a walk, because you don't want them kicking that dung around. Now, what you want to do now is find the piles of dung, and if you're collecting into the individual containers, you're going to pick up probably 5 to 10 pellets. Try and at least half fill the little jars, and you will do that until you've got all 10 of them filled up. I'll just show you there in this particular bag. There's a larger container there. They're the sort that you're going to use if you're going to collect a bulk sample. Just follow along in a bit of a grid pattern where the sheep were until you've filled up each of your containers, or if you're doing a bulk sample, you'll be collecting maybe 1 to 3 pellets depending on the size of the sheep, just an even amount from each pile, until you've got about half to 1 cup of sample there. So as I mentioned, the samples you send to the lab or that you use yourself can either be from 10 individual sheep, or they can be from a larger number of sheep where their samples are combined together, which we call bulk sampling. If you decide to take up worm egg counting, whether you do it yourself or through a lab, WormBoss does recommend you do bulk sampling because it does increase the accuracy. It's more representative of the mob. Now, the following animation is just a short snippet of mixing samples. But you should see our other webinar that's coming up called Bulk Worm Tests Increase Accuracy. Now you can see here I'm holding a couple of the individual samples, but I've got in front of me a larger jar of feces that we can mix up for a bulk sample. This one just happens to be in quite good pellet type forms, and so I can actually mix that up through a blender, one of those little personal blender things, and you know, it only takes 10 seconds, a quick pulse, and you've got a nice mix. This one, it really pulverizes it and comes out sort of dry and powdery. And once you've got that, you can mix it a little bit more, and then you can pop it back into the jar and send that to the lab or you can mix it yourself if you're going to be doing your own tests. Sometimes though, your samples will be quite gluggy, and I can tell you they don't do well in the blender. They'll just blast around the side and clag up the little blades. So I find that if I chop them up with a knife for a little while, and then I sort of knead them a bit like bread dough and squash them back and forth, whatever you do, you've just got to make sure that you really do a thorough job of mixing them. Once you've done that, again, they can be put in your containers and sent to the lab, or you do your own sampling. If you're lucky enough, well, maybe not lucky enough, if the samples are quite sloppy, usually they're pretty easy to mix. Just stir them a lot and you'll find that they will mix. Okay, so if the conditions are suitable after you've been collecting these fecal samples, the worm eggs can start to hatch after about 24 hours out of the sheep. So this can result in your egg count becoming lower the longer this time is and the more suitable those temperature and moisture conditions are. Therefore, you should do your count or get it to the lab as fast as you can. Now, you can largely prevent the development by doing one of two things. First thing is cooling the samples, but if you need larval culture, then refrigerating the samples can affect how many Barbus poleworm will hatch, and this could bias the proportions of the worm type in the sample. So if you're in a warmer area or at a warmer time of the year, you can refrigerate your sample if you're not intending to culture it, but otherwise, if it's hot, just simply place those samples in a little esky with an ice brick till you're ready to take them or send them to the lab, just so they're not refrigerator cold. And in some areas of Australia, it can actually be pretty useful to put ice bricks in with the samples when they're sent in transit, especially if they're going to be a few days getting to the lab. The other thing you can do to help prevent the development of the eggs while they're in transit is to exclude all air from the samples. Now, this can be difficult in a jar, but if you've got enough sample that you can really fill the jar right to the very top so there's no air in it, that will be very handy. Or if you put any samples into a plastic bag, like a Ziploc bag, you can exclude the air out of that, and that will really help to stop development. Now, when completing your lab forms, sometimes they ask for a lot of info, but just make sure you do include your details, the collection date, and exactly what testing you want done. And regarding a larval culture, you can specify that you only want a culture done, for instance, if the average egg count is at a certain level, maybe 500 eggs per gram, but that's something you should talk to your lab about. Pack your samples in what's been provided in your kit, and if you don't use a lab kit, please ensure that your samples can't leak or break open in transit. Now I'm just going to show you here an egg count that's being done at home. It's just handy for you to know what's involved. We're not going to teach you how to do an egg count in this webinar, but if you've got some idea what's involved, it's pretty handy. Now, this animation shows Murray. He was the one collecting the eggs, the fecal samples from the paddock before. Murray is putting some saturated salt solution into a container, and then he's using some of that to measure out his feces. He's using a displacement method, but sometimes other people weigh the sample. And then the fecal sample goes into the container. He gets his little mixer, gives it a really thorough mix. He puts it through a sieve, and that gets rid of a lot of the materials that are in the feces that clog it all up a bit. Then he takes a bit of the sample out. He puts that into a special slide, That goes on the microscope, and then he has a look down the microscope and to look for the worm eggs. Now, as you see, this one's a Whitlock slide, but some people use other types of slides. But it has a chamber in there where the liquid from the sample goes in underneath between two pieces of glass, and there's actually these little runways on the slide, and the lab technicians or yourself will count up and down these little runways until they've got a final egg count. This just shows you a couple of things. First of all, these big round black things here, they're air bubbles, and if you can see them really sharply and clearly, you know you're focusing on the right spot, because they rise up under the glass, and so do the worm eggs. So here's some of our worm eggs, and I've got no idea what those ones are. They're strongyle eggs. They could be Barber's pole worm, they could be brown stomach worm or black scour worm. The thing is, they all look much the same, and that's why we get a larval culture done as well, because you can't differentiate them mostly under the microscope. And then Murray here, he's writing down his number of eggs that he's seen in relation to the mob that he was testing, and based on the slide he's using and the dilution that he's used, he will use a multiplication factor to figure out eggs per gram. Okay. Now, I'll just go on first to the next one. Now, this one's Sarah Bowers at the GIST laboratory. She's just showing you how to do a larval culture. Just a quick shot of this. Taking the remaining part of the sample, and then we've got a container here, and just using the remaining stuff after the egg count, get some vermiculite, and then we mix it up. Let's get that. Add a bit of water to it, give it a thorough mix, and then once that's done, it goes into the jar. When we've done that, fill the jar up, we put that into an incubator, and then that goes for about 7 days. Once it comes out, you can see some things on the side of the jar. We have another look close up, and what we see is larvae. These worm larvae here, that's not just one larvae, that's actually a whole pile of little larvae. And they've sort of migrated up the side of the jar. Now, what happens next is water gets added to that jar, it gets turned upside down and put into a petri dish, and a little bit of water is added, and it's just left for a little while. And then, after that, the larvae sort of come down into the bottom of the petri dish. You take up some of that liquid, put it into a test tube, and then leave that sit for a little while, and after a little while you end up with the larvae all down there in the bottom of the test tube. Now, just take out, use a pipette, take out the larvae from the bottom, put it onto a slide here, then you use some iodine to stain it, pop it under the microscope, have a counter here to have a look which worm larvae they actually are, and then have a look at the larvae. Now, I can't tell you, this requires considerable expertise that I certainly haven't got, but based on looking at tails and heads and other parts of the larvae, the people in the lab can actually tell you what species they are and then they can do a percentage of the count based on which ones they're seeing. This one here actually has a black scoureworm, I believe, and a Barber's poleworm in it, but I can't tell the difference. I haven't got that expertise, and that's why you send it to a lab. Okay, so that's how a larval culture is done, and I think it's just handy that you have some idea what's involved and that there is some complexity to it, and that's why it's pretty good to send it to a lab. Now, I haven't got time. That's something that I hear some people say, and I don't know, I'm probably being a bit cheeky saying that you haven't got time to worm test because you're too busy drenching, but in reality this is often true. Now, an integrated worm control program will reduce the number of drenches you need to give, and it's quite easy to get into a routine for worm testing, even if you haven't done that before. You know, have your kit, have it in your vehicle, and when you go out to check your mobs for water or their feed or checking for flies or so forth, you collect your samples. And you've seen on the little video how easy it is, and really it's a lot less effort than drenching, particularly if your mob doesn't need to be drenched. So for me, I just have a reminder in my diary and I collect samples in the first week of each month. What about if you think it takes too long to get results? Well, the worm egg count results are generally sent back within 24 hours of the lab receiving your samples. It does take longer for a larval culture because the incubation period is 7 days. But remember, there's no point waiting until you see signs of worms before you get around to testing. More often than not, if you think it takes too long, it's because you've waited too long and are already seeing the signs of worms. And if you worm test regularly and proactively, not reactively, you'll be able to drench at the most cost-effective time. That is, before you've started to experience significant production loss. Now, in moderate to high rainfall areas, it's a good idea to test every 4 to 6 weeks. 4 weeks in more of the peak Barber's poleworm season, 6 weeks as you're going in through winter. In drier areas, you can wait and worm test, say, 6 weeks after you've had rain that's resulted in green pick, because the green pick's a really good indicator that worms are active. If you're in areas where Australia Post can be a problem, it might be a good idea to organise to have a courier take your samples, because you don't want the eggs hatching in transport. Now, finally, there's a proportion of people that do think that testing is too expensive, but if you do nothing to take your reliance off drenching, then the time since last drenching or seeing signs are valid indicators that a drench is needed. But it won't be cost effective because you will already be suffering production loss, and that production loss and the value of that will have been more than the cost of testing. So if you use tests, even though there's a price to them, if you use tests with an integrated worm control program, you should be able to control your worms better and more cheaply than not using testing. I've been using worm testing and the WormBoss program on my property in Guyra, which is arguably one of the highest sort of Barber's poleworm areas in the country. So I've been using that for quite a few years now, and I was able, when I started, to drop 3 or 4 drenches a year based on using this program. The other thing, though, is there are other ways you can further reduce the cost of worm tests. You can do your own tests at home. Obviously, this involves an initial outlay for equipment. You need a microscope, a special slide, various jars and so forth. And it also requires you to have some training. It's certainly not a really difficult skill to learn, but it can be fiddly, it requires some patience, and it's certainly not for everyone. So I think it's worthwhile contacting your local lab and getting some tests done through them. But if you do it at home, it certainly will reduce your cost and you don't have to wait very long for results. Doing bulk tests also will increase the accuracy of your tests and therefore it increases the value of them. And the other thing is you can further reduce costs using bulk tests by including 2 or 3 mobs in one standard 10 count kit. However, this does take a little bit more time on your part because you're going to have to mix the samples at home and you will need to do them very thoroughly. But the other really, really important thing is that if you decide to include more than 1 mob in a 10 count kit, you must never ever mix samples from a couple of mobs together. They must always remain separate. And you've got to keep an accurate record of which samples belong to which mob so that when you get the results back, you can reconcile them against each other. But you can find more details about that in our webinar, Bulk Worm Tests Increase Accuracy. Now, finally, you'll find a lot of resources on the WormBoss website, including service providers and worm egg count training. We've just got up here some of the key ones in New South Wales, not all of them, but these ones service for New England, and these slides, this presentation sponsored by MLA as part of our New England WormBoss producer demonstration site. The WormBoss website's got regional programs and drench decision guides that describe the best times to worm test in your area, and that'll save you money and time. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Deb. Now, Deb, while you just present these links on our last slide, I'd just like to ask listeners to type in any questions they might have, and Deb will answer as many as possible in the next few minutes after she tells you about these links.
Yes, thanks very much, Liz. I really would encourage you to put some questions down in the chat function. Is that right, Liz?
That's right.
Okay, so we'll just mention these links here. So the first is the WormBoss website. It's got stacks of good information on there. You can also subscribe to the ParaBoss news. One of those came out today. If you didn't get that, you need to subscribe. It's a free twice monthly email newsletter, and it contains current recommendations, feature articles, monthly state and regional outlooks we've got contributing district vets and consultants from right across Australia that can contribute to that. And it's not just worms. This newsletter also has fly strike and lice control information, and also covers worms in goats. Now, we also have 2 Facebook pages, one for sheep and one for goats. On the sheep, we just do 3 posts a week, one for flies, one for worms, and one for lice. And on the goats, we just cover worms on that. So thank you very much for listening tonight. And Liz, do we have any questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Deb. We do. We've had a couple of questions come through. The first one was from Edel regarding packing samples for transport. They wanted to know whether you can vac seal the bags to get rid of the air. Vacuum seal. They wanted to know whether vacuum seal.
Yes, you could do that. You could do that. Really what you want to do is just make sure that you just, if it's a bag, sort of flatten it out, and if you want to take the air out with a vacuum, I don't see why that wouldn't work. I've never tried that one, so that's a new one for me, but it should do the job.
Okay, great. Thanks, Deb. I've had another couple of questions. One from Ruth. She does her own testing. She does 10 samples per mob, and she wants to know, should she be doing a bulk test, and how does she go about this?
Okay, yes. When you do the 10 samples, unless you've got a very small mob, you've only got a small number, 10. And if you've got maybe 200 or 400 or more sheep, then that's only a small proportion of mob. So we recommend that sorry, I can't stop this phone now. So we recommend that you do a bulk sample, because what you're going to do there is collect between 20 and 40 samples, from 20 to 40 sheep, and that's going to be far more representative of the mob. Now, the process, I don't think we've got time to cover it here, but we will have a webinar that deals specifically with bulk sampling. So just keep an eye out for that.
Great. That was actually the next question, Deb. It was from Nick. When was the next webinar, the bulk sampling webinar, going to be? So everyone just keep an eye out for that in the newsletter and on the Facebook pages.
That's right. Unfortunately, we haven't got it scheduled yet, so it will be showing up in our newsletter. So subscribe to ParaBoss News.
Great. Thanks, Deb. We've still got a few more questions. Brian was wondering how to define an effective short-acting drench as recommended for lambs and weaning on the drench decision guides.
Okay, an effective short-acting drench. There's no way that you can tell it's effective unless you actually test it. You can take a punt with some of the newer drenches, such as Zolvix or Zolvix Plus or StarTech, but some of the older drenches can be totally effective on people's places. You've got no idea really until you test it. So we will also have webinars for how to go about testing your drenches, but you can find them right now on the WormBoss website. If you go under tests and tools, you'll find an area in there that will describe a drench check or a drench test. So a drench check is simply when you're going to have a worm account before you drench your mob, and ideally you would have a culture with that. It's quite important, I think, that you do. And then 10 to 14 days, closer to 14 days after you've drenched, then you test again with a culture. And then you compare those before and after, and that's going to tell you whether or not your product has been effective. It's not 100% accurate, and we really recommend that most people should do a drench test or a fecal air count reduction test. That does involve a little bit more work. You've got groups of 10 to 15 sheep, and you drench each of those groups with a specific drench, check them all, and one group doesn't get doesn't get drenched, and then at 14 days afterwards you get worm egg counts from every single sheep, and then you compare the results, the average results for each of those drenched groups to the undrenched group, and that's going to give you a comparison and tell you how well each of those drenches has worked. So the answer really there is, you know it's effective after you've tested and proven that it is.
Okay, thanks, Deb. We've got some great questions coming in. I've got a couple from Alan. He was wanting to know how much difference there is between the most wormy and least wormy sheep in a typical mob. In terms of egg count.
Okay, well, it's really going to depend on when you test them. So, you could go out not too long after they've been drenched, maybe a month after they've been drenched, and you might find some are 0 and some are 800 eggs per gram. If you wait more weeks or months, you might still find some at 0 and some up at 5,000 eggs per gram. So you can still have ones with such a big range like that. Yeah, I would think you could quite easily find 5,000 eggs per gram difference in your mob at times.
Great, and I guess following on from that, if you have a high score in your bulk sample, do you then hone in and sample single animals, or you assume that they all need drenching?
When you do a bulk sample, now we do get this question asked quite frequently when we run workshops. People get worried that when they do the bulk sample, they're not seeing the variation. And the point is that when you're doing 10 counts, sometimes you're not seeing the variation in that either, and you get lulled into a false sense of security. So the WormBoss program, the research done by Lewis Kahn, compared 6 properties, real properties, they weren't research stations, and 3 of the properties just continued to do typical management. 3 of them used this program. The 3 that were using the program used bulk counting, and despite not seeing variation, not getting the benefit of that, they still had something like half the amount of losses. I'm just trying to pull the figures out of the top of my head here. The cost of worms was around about $5 per head for those properties that were using the WormBoss program, and it was something like $11 something for the ones who were using a typical program. So the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. They use that program, they use bulk counts, and you don't need to worry about the variation. Just use the average results you get from a bulk test and use that as your monitoring.
Okay, great, thanks. I think that probably takes care of Nick's next question, which was, does it affect the animals that then might not be scoring high but are getting drenched anyway?
Unfortunately, because of labour costs in Australia, we're always going to be drenching sheep that don't need drenching, and but our thresholds that we've developed take that into account, that there are animals with high levels in the mob. So even though you mightn't really see signs of worms in a sheep till it's way up at 5,000 eggs per gram, we know that we need to drench at a lower level because, the average will be at a lower level because there are some sheep up at that high amount. So our thresholds have been worked out so that we're doing it at a cost-effective time. We're not going to have a pile of deaths up at one end, but of course there will be some sheep in the mob that are still 0 and really didn't need a drench. But because of our labour costs, you can't go and test every animal.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Deb, Alan was wondering about your ideas on pre-lamb drenching and drenching at marking times, I guess strategic drenches.
Righto. Certainly in this region, part of our program is that there is a pre-lambing drench. We like that to be, say, within the last 3 weeks before lambing. But we also recommend that you've prepared low worm risk paddocks up here. That's not always the case in all regions across Australia, so you really do need to look at your particular program depending on what region you're in. But in the New England area, we look to prepare lambing paddocks, and we will have a webinar on that one as well. Then the ewes will get a pre-lambing drench, and if you've done everything right, you then test prior to lamb marking, and in most years you should not need to drench your lambs. If it's so bad that you need to drench your ewes, we recommend that you drench your lambs, so that you always want to do that test before lamb marking. If your ewes don't need drenching, don't drench your lambs. But following the program, a lot of people will quite easily get through lamb marking, and if you do, you might want to test part way between landmarking and weaning. I, for instance, can often manage to get a pre-lambing drench, short-acting pre-lambing drench given. I can get through landmarking, I can get through weaning, and then I get another couple of months. But I do have a very thorough program of preparing my paddocks, and it doesn't work in every year, but in a lot of years it does. So the final thing on there is test before landmarking. If you need drenching, then drench your lambs as well.
Okay, great.
Otherwise not.
Thanks, Deb. And this question actually probably follows on from that in terms of preparing low worm risk paddocks. Again, from Alan, he was interested in what conditions are needed for a worm population to die out in a paddock.
Okay. Time and exposure are the key things. So, and heat. So, in the New England, I guess we've got some of the coldest winters. When we're preparing a lambing paddock, we need about 6 months to get the larval level down to only a few % of what it was. And that's what we would consider a low worm risk paddock. In the same place, but for a weaning paddock, to get to that same level, because we typically wean in early summer, the time that when we're preparing the weaning paddocks is much warmer. And when the larvae are in warmer conditions, they're more active and they run out of energy faster. So when you're preparing in a cold time, it's going to take longer for the larvae to die, up to say 6 months. And in hotter areas, it only takes probably even 2 months in much of the hotter sheep producing areas. Here we would use 3 months for weaning paddocks, 6 months for lambing paddocks. But if you're in much hotter areas, it could be as little as 2 months. And of course, in that time, you don't want any more contamination occurring. The barer that your paddock is as well, and the more exposed the larvae will be, the more they'll be warmer and die faster as well.
Thanks, Deb. I guess as a follow-up to that, Deb, we should just mention that there are actually going to be a series of webinars over the next few months released as part of the producer demonstration site project, and they'll be covered. Some of these topics, such as preparing low worm risk paddocks, bulk worm testing, they'll all be covered in this series of webinars. So really keep an eye out for them as they come through, because they'll be great webinars to join in on, and a lot of your questions will be answered through those too.
Sure, Liz, and of course, it's all on our website anyway, and we often have feature articles on the ParaBoss News as well.
Yeah, that's right. Deb, I have a question here from Lachlan. He's a producer from an area of high rainfall over the spring-summer period, and they see a huge spike in Barber's pole egg counts the 6 weeks following the previous drench. He wants to know what your opinion on drench protocols in this time of rapid larval hatching is, i.e. short and long-acting residuals, and are there methods of breaking the egg larval cycle within the pasture, such as using fungal products, and if so, what's their efficacy?
Okay, that's a lot of things. So it sounds like there's a bit of a problem there. We've got heavily contaminated pastures after the rain. Sheep are getting rapidly reinfected. Look, honestly, there's no difference to the country up where around I live in the New England. It's just like that. You can break it, but it does take a little bit of an effort and planning, and that the program of preparing paddocks and so forth will do that. If you don't go about making those sort of changes, you're faced with this high contamination level constantly, and you sort of never get off the drenching merry-go-round. So there's no answer there. If you don't do it, you're going to keep being faced with those problems. If you do try and prepare paddocks, you can start to get them under control. In the short term, you could consider using a long-acting product for your most susceptible sheep, especially for the likes of weaners, lambs at weaning. You could use them. I know that a lot of people choose and have done for many years, use long-acting products at lambing because they're so worried that they're going to get caught out. And one of the difficulties I will mention is that if you use a moxidectin, a long-acting moxidectin injectable product, and you use that just before lambing, we do know that it goes through in the milk, and it certainly has great potential to cause more drench resistance because the lambs are getting, as those lambs are starting to be born, the earliest ones, and when they're starting to just graze a little bit while the drench is still working, there's the potential that they've got a sublethal dose of the drench in them, which then allows some of those worms that they're bringing in, the worm larvae, to survive. So it can actually potentially increase drench resistance by giving moxidectin as a pre-lambing drench. Up here we certainly prefer to use it where the tail of it falls into the cold period. Liz, what have I missed here? I've talked about the fact that you could use a long-acting if you've got this high contamination. Really, it goes back to your susceptible sheep preparing your pastures. There's a bit of work involved in that, but it really has a dramatic impact.
Yeah, Lachlan was also, sorry Deb, but Lachlan was also interested in fungal products and whether or not they,
yes. Sure, maybe I should ask you, Liz, since you did your PhD on this years ago. But we know that there's been a lot of work on those fungal products over many, many years, and they are proven to work. My understanding from talking to the company is that you've got sort of something like about a 60 to 70% effectiveness of them. Now, people may not understand how they work. There is only one product that you can buy at the moment, so I'm happy to mention the name. It's called BioWormer, and it's it has to be fed to the animals daily during the period of time that you're trying to get an effect. And it does nothing to kill the worms in the sheep. Make sure you understand that. It is not in any way, shape or form a drench type product. What it does, the sheep is really a delivery mechanism. The fungus goes through the sheep, comes out in the dung, and then it's in the dung on the ground with the worm eggs, and as the eggs hatch and turn into larvae, the little fungal hyphae, the little bits they put out, essentially grab and strangle the larvae and kill them. Now, they don't kill all of them. As I'm saying, you might have something like a 60 or 70% effectiveness, but they do dramatically decrease the amount of larvae that continue to go through in that cycle. So that's how the fungi work. It does work, but you are restricted to feeding it in a sort of a grain mix, that you cannot feed it at this point in time in a block.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Deb. Just back to the worm populations dying on paddocks. I had a question from Brian. He was interested to know if frost can kill and affect the length of contamination on pasture.
Okay, this is a tricky one. I like to say no, it doesn't kill them. It does really, if the larvae are completely exposed to the frost, yes, it can kill them. But the point is, we know that in the New England, where we have frosts on frosts on frosts, those larvae are still there. So they're pretty damn tough. Eggs, worm eggs aren't so tough, especially Barber's pole worm eggs. We're lucky if they last about 5 days or so. If they don't hatch and turn into larvae, they pretty much die. But once they do turn into larvae, they're tough as nails. And they'll live through the frosts, especially if you've got a bit of pasture there to give them some protection. So during those frosty winter times, you're looking at something like 6 months to kill the majority of larvae. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Deb. Brian was also interested to know if you can test paddocks for worm larvae.
Yes, you can, but no, you can't. It's really a research type process, unfortunately. It's one of the things in one of our previous workshops that we've had that's been highlighted as a really important thing we'd love people to be able to do. But currently, the how to do it usefully requires you to cut something like 10% of the pasture, and so that's just not realistic. We'd love there to be a commercial way to do it, but currently, no, we can't.
Brian had one more question. He was wondering whether or not culling sheep on DAG score is an effective way to help as an effective part of your worm control program.
Not totally. If we're talking about up here in New England, we don't tend to have DAG very much, so it's not going to be something in the summer rainfall areas that you're going to look at. If you're in southern Australia, you've got DAG, but it's not always related to high worm egg counts or high worm burdens. DAG can also be there from hypersensitivity scouring, and which is a whole subject in itself. So what we recommend is that you select based on worm egg count to look for resistance to worms in the sheep, but because there will generally be only a small proportion of a mob consistently scour after their initial, as lambs to hogget sort of age, once they are exposed to worms, a lot of the mob will scour. But after that, it's then some sheep are much more prone to it. So we also suggest that you should cull on DAG, but not in young lambs. Once they're older, you'll start to find that it's a repeatable thing. Those same sheep are going to be scouring as adults, so it's a good idea to cull them at that stage. But it's not necessarily going to do anything to improve your worm control program. It's just that some sheep, think of it like an allergy. It's not quite an allergy. They're just more sensitive to the larvae, and it causes them to scour an awful lot. But they won't necessarily be the ones that have lots of worms.
Okay, great. And I think, Deb, we've probably just got one final question from Lachlan. He wanted to know what some of the key pasture preparation techniques to help reduce pasture contamination, especially on areas that are irrigated and have minimal potential for mixed special grazing.
Oh, okay. That's a tricky one for the irrigation. The things that we suggest for paddock preparation, the simple answer is you don't contaminate that paddock again with more worm egg count, with more worm eggs that are going to hatch into larvae. So there's a couple of things there. You could take all the sheep out, and therefore you're not going to contaminate it. But for a lot of people, that's going to be really difficult. So you could put a long-acting drench into them, but you have to really consider whether or not that's a good idea. But that's one option. You could use that pasture for some other reason, but I think you're suggesting that if there's no cattle or something there to use it, then it's going to waste. So that's very problematic. In other areas, if you're not on irrigation, you would try to not have it wasted, so you would graze it with cattle, or you would time it, if possible, to coincide with growing that crop or the pasture, or spelling it for a while and then regrowing it, or you could make hay or some other use, or else, as I say, if you can, be drenching the sheep as they go onto that pasture and keep them on there only for the time that drench is effective. That could be a short-acting drench for just close to 3 weeks, or it could be longer for if you're using a long-acting product. But critically, and we found with some of the participants in our project, if you don't yet know whether your drench is effective, you could actually be thinking you're preparing the paddock, but you're contaminating it. And the final thing up here is that sometimes there are times when the worm eggs won't hatch to larvae. So especially in Barber's poleworm area, those Barber's poleworm eggs are a bit finicky. They need the right temperature, the right moisture for about 5 days or a week after they've been dropped onto the ground. If they don't get it in that time, they'll die. And if it's too cold, they die. If it's too dry, they're going to die. So if you know that, you can certainly exploit Barber's poleworm. Much harder though with your scaleworm eggs. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Deb. Actually, we've just had a final question come in, and it's actually on worm egg counts. Peter was interested in knowing that if he doesn't get a larval culture done, how does he know what worms to drench for?
Okay. It's a bit of a guess, but you start off by thinking, where am I? If I'm in southern Australia and not on irrigation, not near the coast, then you're much more likely to have scaleworms. And in fact, a lot of people down in southern Australia never do larval cultures and manage quite well with it. If you're in a summer rainfall area on irrigation or on a coastal area, then it's a bit hit and miss. There's a good chance you've got Barber's poleworm, but you could also have scourworms. If you just say, oh, look, that's a really high count, I'm over 1,000 eggs per gram, that's Barber's poleworm, 90% of the time, you're probably right. But there are times where that's not the case, and sometimes people have been tricked. They're really high scourworm counts. So all you can do is your best guess for the particular area you're in and assume that high counts are mostly Barber's poleworm, but really doing larval cultures at least now and then will give you some idea what's going on your property, and yeah, they'll let you know where you're going.
All right, great. Well, that's actually it for questions. Deb, it's been a great webinar though, and I hope everybody got a lot out of this, and I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking Deb for a really fantastic presentation. Thanks very much, Deb, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. I know it was a bit chilly, but hopefully you can sit by the fire now and have a nice cup of tea. Anyway, good night, everyone.
Thanks, Liz. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks, Deb.